I wanted to show you how I made this stitch sampler for two of the stitches on my sewing machine. One is the zigzag stitch and one is the buttonhole stitch. And I did this because every time I do applique, I have to go and practice which size stitch I want, so I have to play with the numbers. I decided I would just do a little sample and see what they look like. And so I'm going to tell you how I did this and the pros and cons of what I did. I cut this 3 inches wide by the width of the fabric. And what I did, if you look on the back, I stitched a bunch of seam lines. And I'll show you how I did that in a minute. I stitched the seam lines and pressed them to one side because I wanted this little lip here to sort of simulate a piece of fabric on top of another piece of fabric, as the applique would be. So I started off with, here I have 17, that's the stitch number of the zigzag stitch on my machine. And so I started off with 3, the width of 3 and the length of 3. And you can write these however you want, however your machine has it. Mine happens to have the width first and then the length, the stitch width and the stitch length. So this is a width of 3 and a length of 3. And then I just repeated it here because this was my first try at it. And you'll see at the top here, I always had trouble starting. And this is because of the needle plate. And if you look at my video on needle plates, you'll see why this happens. And it's not a big deal because when you're appliquing something, you're always going to start in the middle somewhere. You're not going to really most of the time start at the end. So this was just looks kind of funky here, but I don't care about that because I just want to see what the stitches look like. So here then I just repeated it just to see how the width would be here, and this was too narrow here, the space between the two. So I increased it here and I thought, well, this is too much. So here it was, I kept the width at 3 and I changed the length to 3.5. So you see it makes them bigger. And to me this is not pretty at all. I'm using a contrasting thread. This is white fabric and I used sort of a tan or natural color thread. In reality what you would do is match your thread to your applique piece. So if I were appliquing this red onto this white, I would use red thread. So anyway, so then I just go on and I just marked the stitch number here just to keep track of it, and then I changed the stitch length to 4 and you see it got bigger, and then I went way down to a stitch width of 1.5 and a length of 2.5, and I thought, well, this is kind of small, and then I bumped it up a little bit on the stitch width here, and it was getting better, but I still didn't like it. And then I bumped the width back down and then the length up to 2, and this is what I came up with. I like this a lot because it's not too heavy. The stitches aren't that close together and they're very tiny. You want to take a little bitty bite out of each piece when you zigzag because you don't really want it to show. If you do want it to show, then you would use one of these bigger ones here and maybe make the stitch length smaller, and it would be a nice decorative stitch, like a satin stitch. So then I bumped it down again, and these the stitch length here was 1, and so this is way too small. That I don't like that at all. And then I bumped it up to 1.5 stitch length and 1.5 stitch width, and this is what I like. So I'll try this when I start my applique, and sometimes I might adjust per the applique depending on what it is. Then next I went to my buttonhole stitch, and I had a little trouble with this one because it didn't seem to want to change. So this was the buttonhole stitch here, so this should be a 19. Let's change this to 19. And I did the same thing here. I started with the settings that it automatically starts with, and then I just kept changing settings. And when I got down to, I like this one, and then I like this one too. So this way you have something to keep. You don't have to go through this every time you're going to applique. And so you just have your samples here. You can look at them. So how I did this on the back of the fabric, I marked a 1.5 inch line. This is a little bit more, but it's about 1.5 inches from the other line. So here's one line, and then I'll put this one here again, and 1.5 inches, and then move it down another 1.5 inches, and then do that all the way down. And this, I used the Max spray starch, so it made it a little stiff. And then I take each one of these and I fold on the drawn line, and then stitch a 1/4 inch seam allowance right here. Remember, you're working from the back. So when you do all these, you turn it over, and I pressed all these seam lines in one direction. So you would turn this over and press all in this direction. Then you have your little segments you can use. And then you see I still have the rest of this. If I ever want to try something else, I can just have it there and do it once, and then I've got a record of it.